Well, we have had some hard words in our readings this week. Our gospel passage, in particular, is one of several readings that really upset people who want to maintain the image of a nice Jesus. There was a member at my previous church who insisted that Jesus could never have said these things. Jesus could not have preached against family, he felt, because family is the most important thing in the world. But of course, Jesus isn't exactly preaching against family. Rather, he's preaching for the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is so radically inclusive that it makes some people uncomfortable. In the kingdom of God, Black lives matter. In the kingdom of God, LGBTQ lives matter. Which means that the kingdom of God is a place of liberation, a place of freedom, a place where those who have been marginalized now have pride of place. And this makes it incredibly threatening for some. Sometimes even people within the same family. And this kind of division is incredibly painful. It's ironic, of course, that we hear these words on Father's Day, one of those complex, meaning-laden secular holidays that clergy struggle over how to best acknowledge and engage in worship services. Now, Jesus knew nothing of Father's Day, nor of the fragility of the modern nuclear family under late-stage capitalism. Jesus was not preaching to people like us. Rather, Jesus spoke these words before sending the disciples out on their audacious mission of preaching and healing. Jesus knows that the disciples will encounter resistance of all kinds. He knows that faithful proclamation and practice of the gospel will put them on a collision course with the powers that be, not to mention their families back at home. The disciples, of course, have left all that they know in order to follow Jesus. They have experienced incredible healing and freedom in and through Jesus' words and actions. But Jesus is now inviting them into a deeper and more frightening level of vulnerability. As we heard in last week's gospel reading, Jesus denies the disciples money, pay, extra clothing, a staff for protection, even sandals for their missionary journeys. They are to undertake their mission in complete vulnerability and dependence on God. And families then, just like families now, probably had a hard time understanding why their sons would throw everything away for this Jesus. Throw away a steady fishing income and the possibility of marriage and children for this itinerant lifestyle with no security, following in the footsteps of a radical nobody like Jesus. The disciples' lifestyle, which can sound quaint to our ears, wasn't any quainter then than it would be now. It was rebellious, risky, renegade. It was countercultural. It caused offense, especially for those closest to the disciples, their own families. We have no record of what the disciples' families really thought about their choice to follow Jesus, to relinquish custom and obligation, to go their own way. Surely families were not thrilled by this choice. Some might have applauded Jesus' ministry from the sidelines. But when he took their own children away from them, they likely changed their tunes. Just like those who are fully supportive of gay people, but when their own child comes out, find themselves nevertheless embroiled in a grieving process, mourning the loss of a particular future that they had always imagined. So what is the purpose of Jesus' discourse in this passage? Is it to scare away disciples who aren't fully committed? Or is it to encourage them to persist in spite of their fear? And how might we hear Jesus' words so many generations removed? Ultimately, I think Jesus is trying to address the disciples' fear head on. Do not be afraid, he tells them. That most repeated of all gospel refrains, do not be afraid. Which must have meant that the disciples clearly had something to fear. that the ministry they were doing with Jesus was more obviously threatening than it usually appears to us. Someone was going to want to kill them. The passage, of course, ends with some of Jesus's most iconic words. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Words that have encouraged people throughout the millennia to take all manner of risks for the sake of the gospel. This promise of dying and rising taken to heart, a trust that life comes through death. As Paul's letter to the Romans puts it, if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. For some of us, though, these words are almost purely symbolic. They can't mean literal suffering, literal death. Contemporary spirituality doesn't have much room for anything that smacks of masochism. When we speak of being buried in the waters of baptism, many of us don't think all that much is really happening. But for the disciples, this was a far more literal business than we'd like to admit. Contemporary Christianity just isn't very risky. It's pretty easy to be an Episcopalian. And so we've lost track of some essential element of the early faith, and I dare say a pretty important element. You may or may not know, but the Episcopal Church has been in pretty significant numerical decline for several decades now. Hundreds of thousands of members have died or simply left, leaving gaping vacancies in their wake. No one seems to want to take their places. My generation and the ones before and after me have largely lost interest in church. And of course, there's been plenty of hand-wringing about these sobering trends, lots of proclamations about how to save the church. And yet I wonder if the answer might actually be simpler and scarier than we'd like to admit. I, for one, think we'll continue to hemorrhage members if we don't embrace the idea that Christianity is meant to be at least a little bit dangerous. If we're not offending someone, we probably haven't grasped the fullness of the gospel, the depth of transformation into which Jesus invites us. You see, we are actually being invited to become different people. We are being invited to really become brothers and sisters to one another in a world that wants us to be lonely and alienated in order to sell us more consumer goods. We are being invited not so much to serve the lonely, the lost, and the least, but to become their siblings, to invite them into our home, our family, the church, where we can provide mutual aid rather than one-sided charity. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas is credited as saying, "The church doesn't have a social ethic. The church is a social ethic." By which he means that when the church is being the church most faithfully, it enfleshes a different way for humans to live together in community. A way of life that is based on confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Being in real relationship with people quite different than yourself. The church most faithfully being the church then cannot proclaim cheap grace, cheap love, but rather the church makes the offer of costly grace. In the words of theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs us our life. And it is grace because it gives us the only true life. And this, I think, is what people hunger for. What might make the church a compelling and credible witness to God's healing and love in a world of sin and pain. Human beings gathered together seeking to be a foretaste of the peaceable kingdom. This is what we could be, church, a foretaste of the kingdom of God. If ever there was a time when the world needed a vision of possibility and hope, a path beyond division and strife, the present moment seems like such a time. Do you dream of becoming, church, a place of liberation, a place of freedom, a place where those who have been marginalized are given pride of place, a place that practices confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation? Church, if we could be that place, that dangerously liberating kind of place, we could change the world. Are you in?